Hey everyone. In this video I wanted to cover some of the key concepts of Chapter 3. I put together a PowerPoint, and as I was putting together the PowerPoint it got pretty long, a little longer than I intended, as there's really a lot of, I think, important ideas here that I wanted to cover. Hopefully I'm going to try to keep the video from getting too long and just cover the basics. Some of these are things that I think will also be fleshed out in more depth later in the course and in the ensuing chapters. But first of all, this chapter is called Arguing. I mean, the book is called Arguing About Literature. This chapter is how to argue about literature. So it's appropriate that we spend a little bit of time talking about what literature is. And literature is one of those terms. It's a little loaded in the sense that when people call something literature, they're usually making as much a claim about themselves as about the work. In other words, I am sort of smart enough and sophisticated enough to judge this book as being literature as opposed to something else. But part of the reason why people have the license to do this is because the definition of literature has changed over time. The editors of this book refuse to endorse a single definition. As they point out, it originally was connected with reading. So does that mean that literature only applies to written texts? Some would say yes, though if we're talking about reading, there's a sense in which we could say that we read a movie or a TV show or a piece of music in much the same way that we read something that's written on the page, in terms of processing the information, evaluating it, interpreting it, etc. I think at the end of the day, for me, it becomes a question of, like, how important are the distinctions that we're making, right? So if, how important is it that, what we're experiencing is actually written in English as opposed to, put together as a film? I think both of those genres are valid and have their strengths of weaknesses, and I would tend to consider both of them as literature, because I view literature as much in terms of what we do with it as in terms of what it is, and so I focus here more on what the editors say that we can do or how we can benefit from literature, as a way of really coming up with a definition of what literature is. So so based on how they think students can benefit, we can conclude that they believe that literature encourages the analysis and synthesis of ideas. Literature encourages the audience to interpret and evaluate it. Literature attempts to capture the complicated and elusive nature of truth, unlike, say, an instruction manual, which is trying to, if it's a good instruction manual, it's trying to be straightforward and direct. Literature is trying to capture things about life that are a bit more ambiguous. Literature engages us on an emotional and intellectual level. Literature enlarges our sense of self and world by helping us comprehend and appreciate people, ideas, and lifestyles that are different. All right. So, so if we take these ideas, we can, of things that we do with literature and ways that literature can benefit us, I think that we can sort of backtrack from that to, sort of a general idea of what literature is. And, and one of the things you might notice is that, it's our definition is not necessarily specific to writing. It's not necessarily specific to fiction. Because I think that nonfiction, and this is a point they made, nonfiction has been considered literature in the past. It often is considered literature right now, provided that it's doing these things. So a nonfiction essay might, accomplish some of these goals and might be worthy of being considered literature. We could even maybe take some of the essays that we read from chapter 1, like A New Moral Compact and Disconnected Urbanism, and discuss them as literature in the sense that, for example, I think they both attempt to engage us on an emotional and intellectual level. I mean, they both sort of engage with issues that are ambiguous, where there's some moral ambiguity involved. Even though they both sort of have an agenda, a specific point that they want to make, and something that they want people to do, I think that there are ways that we can sort of analyze and interpret and discuss those works as literature. So the example of literature that's given, I want to spend a little time on this, is Jamaica Kincaid's very short story, Girl. Okay, just a few things I want to point out about the story before we continue. The entire story consists of one long compound sentence. For the most part, it's correctly punctuated. Right, it's she uses semicolons to separate independent clauses. If you remember all this from English 101, so it's for the most part pretty well punctuated as a sentence. The compound sentences, we don't encourage them to be quite as long as hers. There are apparently two speakers in Girl. Okay. There's no third-person omniscient narrator. We start off with the first speaker who is giving instructions to presumably a young woman. So the other speaker is the one receiving the instructions. The second speaker's sentences are in italics, but still contained within the long compound sentence of the story. So in other words, they're also separated by semicolons from the other clauses. And the second speaker's short parts, essentially interrupt the flow of what the first speaker is saying. It seems that the first speaker is giving, advice, instructions that focus on how a young woman should behave and what her responsibilities are. Though some of the instructions suggest a degree of resistance and independence. In other words, most of the instructions seem to center around society's expectations, but there's also a sense in which certain instructions sort of encourage her to maintain a certain degree of independence and sort of and be willing to sort of fight for her own values and worth. Okay. Some instructions also seem to be culturally specific to the Caribbean. Kincaid herself grew up in Antigua, though it's not necessarily, it's not specified in the story exactly where the story takes place. So moving ahead to the main content of the chapter, so essentially we get a series of strategies for arguing about literature. The first strategy is to identify issues, and then the editors provide 10 different types of issues that you can identify. So the idea here is that if we're going to engage in a real discussion and an attempt to create, say, an essay about a work of literature, one of the things we want to do is try to identify the issues that we want to discuss. All right. And issues are broadly defined as aspects of the text about which people have disagreed or might disagree. things that are ambiguous. Okay. One thing the editors say that I find useful is to consider choices that the writer made. We may not necessarily where it's unclear exactly why the writer made that choice. Right. So if you think of, for example, in Girl, why have the fact that the entire story is one long compound sentence. Okay, so that was a specific choice that the writer made. It's an unusual choice, and it's unclear exactly why the writer made that choice. So that would be an issue. So that would be something that's worthy of discussing. So we could talk about issues. So here are the types of issues. So again, they identify 10 of them, and some of them I'm going to spend more time on than others. We have issues of facts. Okay, moments when certain facts are omitted or obscured. The story doesn't tell us exactly where it takes place, but instead provides us with hints about the location and the culture. Issues of theme. All right, this one I'm going to spend a little more time on. So, a theme can be understood as a central idea the text explores, or quoting from the chapter, the main claim that an author seems to be making in a text. Okay, so a theme should be a mid-level generalization. So something that's specific to the conflicts and relationships within the text, but not so specific that it's not also relevant outside the text. So part of the point is that this should be some kind of observation about humanity, life, or the world that is revealed by and explored within the text. Okay, so some aspect of the human experience that this text is being under the microscope and trying to explore. All right, but again, you want to try to make it as specific as possible to the the actual conflict and relationships within the text. So, so the example given in some cultures, women prepare girls for adulthood by teaching them to follow conventions and to assert themselves. So what makes this a mid-level generalization is that it's specific to women preparing girls as opposed to just parents preparing children. Because that's the specific relationship we have, and that distinction is important. It addresses, how women prepare girls for adulthood within the story, and it also accounts for the fact that there may be some cultural differences, right? That there's specific cultural information that we're given, cultural hints, and specific things that are, or there's certain advice that are specific to the culture that these individuals live in. All right. So, in general, you want to avoid thinking about or presenting the theme as a recommendation for how to live or act. Especially when we're dealing with fiction. I mean, there are stories that that hit you over the head with a very clear moral. But for the most part, most of what we study as literature, especially in college, is not trying to teach you how to live or how to act. It's not presenting you with a life lesson. Though you may arrive at a life lesson from reading it, but the point of the work is less to give you that lesson and more to capture some aspect of life that is problematic, that is contradictory, that is ambiguous. All right. So there's, for example, I think something about the advice and how it's given that's a little contradictory within the story. That that young girls, young women, at the time and within the culture of the story, are faced with expectations that are at times problematic, at times contradictory, at times perhaps not even in their self-interest. And I think the story is trying to explore that idea. Okay. as opposed to trying to tell us how we should be parents or how we should, teach young women. Okay. Of course, if we go back and we look at, say, if we consider, for example, a new moral compact to be an essay, the we might in that case want to distinguish between, say, the theme of the article and the thesis of the article. Okay, so for a new moral compact, there's a thesis, a specific proposal that he is making, that he is presented in a very unambiguous way. But we may, if we wanted to discuss the theme might have, we might say, have more to do with how he is exploring the extent to which the citizenry should have an obligation to its military, and the extent to which the nature of, say, sacrifice when it comes to military endeavors, the extent to which the citizenry should be expected to sort of sacrifice for the country, right? So if we decide to send people off to war, how much should that sacrifice be shared by people with, who by the entire citizenry, by people who are not necessarily fighting or have not necessarily volunteered for the army. So so that seems to be sort of the issue. And if we think about the theme, I think the theme, he wants to, the central claim that he wants to make is that, this sacrifice should be shared. And we do have a moral obligation. People have a moral obligation to acknowledge and share with that sacrifice. Okay. And then we might get more specific to when we talk about the thesis, which is which we could say is the specific proposal that he makes, right? So so a theme would be a little more general than a thesis, with something like that, with something like an article, if we're looking at it as a literature. All right. So moving on, other types of definitions, so or other types of issues. So we have issues of definition, trying to decide what an author means by a particular word or concept. In the chapter they discuss, what it means to be a girl. That would be an issue of definition, which we would distinguish from an issue of symbolism, right? So, a symbol is an object, image, or action that represents an idea, all right? And, unlike a sign or a word, these things communicate an idea. So there's a difference between representing an idea and communicating an idea. A stop sign is there to communicate the idea that you are supposed to stop here, right? It's not intended to be, it's not there for us to stop and interpret, right? It's intended to be direct and literal, all right? Even though there are elements of a stop sign that have a certain representational effect, like our association of the color red with danger. So there might be symbolic aspects to a sign like a stop sign, but when we're talking about symbolism, we want to distinguish between sort of the literal intention of what we're looking at and the representational intention. So so if something, the example they give is wash, right? So wash has a literal meaning within the text, okay? But it also perhaps has a symbolic meaning too. Perhaps it also represents, an attempt to, as they say, purify, attempt by the first speaker to try to purify this young woman. It has perhaps religious overtones. And so when we get into the symbolism, we're discussing not sort of literally what this idea means within the story, but what it perhaps represents that might be relevant to our understanding of one of the text's themes. Okay, so so with symbolism, there's often room for debate about what exactly a symbol might represent. Whereas if something like a stop sign, there really should not be much room for debate about what the stop sign is trying to communicate. But we might debate over what the red in the stop sign might symbolize within our culture, what that color might represent, and why it's an effective color for a stop sign. Okay, moving on. Issues of pattern. Okay, so looking at how a text is organized, and trying to determine how certain parts relate to other parts. So, particularly, identifying repetition, and I would also add disruption. So, points where pattern is disrupted, like when the young woman interrupts the speaker. So that's a disruption of a pattern that the story has presented. So, so looking, not only for repetition within a story and structure within a story, but also moments where that structure is disrupted, can be relevant to identifying issues of pattern. All right, issues of evaluation. So judgments through audience reader. Three categories that are given: philosophical evaluation, and evaluation of the wisdom of an idea or action, ethical evaluation, and evaluation of the morality of an idea or action, and aesthetic, and evaluation of the artistic success or impact of the text. Okay, so philosophical and ethical, there's some overlap here. Oftentimes, we think of wisdom in terms of morality, but wisdom might also, consider the extent to which, say, a symbol, truly represents an experience that we have. That's or sort of encourages, further. Further thought into the complexity of our lives and our experience, okay, regardless of the moral implications of what is happening in the story. Whereas ethical, we're focusing a little more on, much more on, say, what the characters are doing and what are the moral implications, of what they are doing. Do we consider this right, just? And what also are the moral implications of what the text is doing, what the author is doing within the text. Issues of historical and cultural context. So here we're examining one of the following. We might look at the life of the work's author, the time period in which the work is written, any time period mentioned in the text. So if there's a flashback to the Civil War, its subsequent reception, so how the work was received, by its audience. Was it popular? Was it critically acclaimed? Was it not popular or not critically acclaimed? How was that reception changed over time? Okay, the forms in which the work was published, right? So was it published in different forms or presented in different forms? If you take something like Shakespeare, for example, Shakespeare was initially received as a performance that people watched and listened to. It was ultimately printed for people to read, but it was printed at different times, and those different printings had changes. And so scholars have sort of tried to figure out, based on that, which printings are more authoritative. What are the significance of changes in the text in between printings? So, and then you have, Shakespeare as it's been adapted into film, right? And so if you're studying a Shakespearean play like Othello, it's possible if you're writing a longer essay that you might explore multiple forms in which that play exists. Okay. One thing I want to add going forward, as the all of these issues start to perhaps overwhelm us a little bit, the idea here is not necessarily that when we're writing about literature we're trying to address all of these issues. Okay, so think of these as options. These are different ways that you can approach arguing about or writing about or discussing a work of literature, right? So it's possible to write an essay that just looks at issues of historical and cultural context. It's possible to look at Othello simply in terms of the different forms in which it was published or presented. It could be that that an essay you're writing is focusing more on a close reading of the text, right? So you're not getting into the historical or cultural context at all. You're focusing more on issues of definition, issues of symbolism, or issues of evaluation. All right. So these are just options, different ways that you can explore the ambiguities presented by a work of literature. A few more issues of genre, what kind of text a particular work is. So, when we talk about genre, you might think short stories, novels, plays, nonfiction, fiction, science fiction, fantasy, we can go on and on. These are just categories, right? Because those categories exist and because writers often work within those categories, there are certain expectations that we will bring to the work based on what it is. If you go into, if you're reading, for example, a romance novel, you expect certain things to happen romantically in the novel, right? So if you're reading a romance novel and suddenly it's the sci-fi adventure and, and there's no real love interest that's happening, then that novel's not meeting your expectations, and you're probably wondering why this was considered a romance novel. And so, but sometimes a text will intentionally challenge our genre expectations. Is Girl a short story? Is it a story at all? We call it a short story, but it doesn't seem to meet a lot of our expectations of what a story is. It doesn't seem to have any actual action or a climax or resolution or most of the things we associate with a story. I guess there's action in the sense of people talking to each other, but we seem to call it a short story because it doesn't seem to fit cleanly into any other genre category. So those are things that are perhaps worthy of discussing, because they can help us better understand not only how we define a genre, but also the choices that the author is making to challenge those definitions or those expectations and why those choices are being made. Issues of social policy. So sometimes you might explore how the text exposes problems that require social and political reform. Issues of cause and effect. Why do characters behave the way they do, or how they are affected by the events of the text? Especially when we get into motivations. Like what is motivating a character to do something? If we talk about the authorial effect, we're looking at how the author attempts to affect the reader, right? So, how, for example, David Barno uses ethos, logos, and pathos to affect us. Like we're looking at, discussing authorial effect. We're looking at the strategies he uses to produce a certain effect in the reader. Further strategies for arguing about literature. So we're out of the issues. some of these are really just sort of repeating things that were covered in the first couple of chapters and applying them to literature, making a claim. So, a claim would be a position that not everyone would immediately accept as the obvious truth. With literature, these are typically claims of evaluation or interpretation. All right. Aim to persuade readers that your idea is at least worth considering. And this might seem a little wishy-washy. Obviously, you want to present your ideas in the most convincing way, but it's helpful, when we're arguing and evaluating about literature, to at least acknowledge that some of what we're discussing is just ambiguous, right? I mean, if there were a right answer, then we probably wouldn't have anything to discuss, right? Then, so part of what you're trying to do is appeal, to readers who might be skeptical of your position, by presenting your position in a way that makes it interesting, and doesn't make you come off as overly confident that you are undoubtedly right and they are undoubtedly wrong. Okay. One way to think about this is that, is that you're presenting a theory. Okay. You're not necessarily presenting statements of fact. You're presenting a theory about what the text is doing, what it's trying to do, and how it relates to or impacts the audience. All right. So if you think about it as this is a theory, there may be a better theory, but I like my theory, so I'm going to try to make a strong case for it. If you sort of approach it that way, then that's you can write in a very persuasive way. Consider your audience. One thing they point out that I like to often mention is you always want to assume your audience has read the text, but that you need to recall for this group any features of the text that are crucial to your argument. So you don't need to give a summary of everything that happens in a story when you're writing about it. But what I like to say is assume that your reader has a general, has read the story, has a general understanding of what the story is and what it's about. But maybe they haven't read it in a while. Maybe it's been a year since they actually read the story, so they're probably fuzzy on the details. So any details that are important to your argument, especially involving quotations, right? This is where this comes up. You don't want to assume that that you take a quotation now that the reader is going to identify that quotation and immediately remember what's happening in the story, or what that quotation is describing, and how it's relevant to to what is going on. So those are the things you need to set up for the reader with context. All right, that's why that context is important. When introducing your claims, especially your main claim, you want to consider the readers you disagree with. Okay. Hasty and superficial readers, puzzled readers, and your own divided self. So the first three I think are pretty self-explanatory. The idea is, that you don't want, it's easy to sort of present your views in a way that is not entirely clear because you're the one who's done the thinking and figured it out, and so it's clear to you, right? So part of what you have to do as a writer is to step outside of yourself and try to figure out, okay, well, which part of what I'm trying to say is going to be confusing for my readers, or unconvincing to my readers, either because they're just confused about the text or about what I might be suggesting, or maybe that they haven't read the text very closely. Right, they're not likely to see the things that I'm trying to point out to them, or they just are inclined to disagree with my interpretation. And then, the last one is interesting. Your own divided self. And what the editors are trying to get at here is that, as you're presenting the claim, it's also helpful to, to consider your own hesitations about what you might be saying. All right. So if there are things that where you think that there's uh, you know, uh, where you might potentially, you know, have all the evidence to fully support a claim that you're making. If there's some aspect of what you're saying that is speculative, it's okay to acknowledge that um, uh, on some level, make some kind of concession that, even if it's just with a word like perhaps, as a way of acknowledging that, some of your argument, because we're looking at literature, because we're looking at ambiguity, some of your argument is theoretical. It's not necessarily, um, you know, uh, going to be right. So going on, and we're almost done. Gather and present evidence for your claims. All right. So having just that some of your argument might not be entirely based on evidence. Uh, you still want to have evidence for your argument. I mean, if we think of this as a theory, a theory is only as good as there is evidence to support the theory and the extent to which the theory explains, the totality of what you're discussing, right? So, and this is true for scientific theories too, okay? So if I have a theory of gravity, but that theory of gravity only seems to exist, within my office, okay, but everywhere else it doesn't, my theory breaks down, okay, well then, my theory doesn't seem to capture the totality of what is happening with gravity, all right? And it's not a very convincing theory. Similarly, if your theory only explains something that happens in one part of the story, but something else that happens in the story seems to contradict your theory, then your theory is also not convincing because it's not addressing the totality of the work. All right. So, but you do want to provide evidence, okay, within the text, and depending on the issue you're discussing. If your issue is focused also on the historical context of the text, then some of your evidence should support your claims about that historical context. You want to explain your reasoning, why, how does this evidence support your claim? You want to identify your assumptions, okay, particularly assumptions about what type of evidence is valid. These are called warrants. We usually think of a warrant as something that a judge issues that might allow a police officer to search your home, right? It's the same basic idea, though. The judge is determining is that there is legally valid evidence within your home that of a crime that has been committed, and so therefore the police should have the right to take that evidence, right? So same idea here. If you're choosing a quotation or some research of the historical context, you're making an assumption that this is valid to the point you're trying to make, that's relevant to the point you're trying to make. So you want to be ready to explain that, as part of your analysis. Same thing with assumptions of value. When we're discussing literature, it's impossible to fully separate, our values, our standards of what is good, what is right, what is just. When we're making claims, we're making our interpretations. So you want to be sort of open about sort of the values that kind of guide the way you analyze something, even if you're analyzing it and interpreting it in a morally objective way. It's possible that your conclusions are sort of based on certain values that you have. You want to make use of appeals, logos, ethos, and pathos. Those were covered well in chapter 1. With logos here, we'd be supporting your claims, justifying your evidence, explaining your thought process. Ethos would be presenting yourself as fair and willing to respect and make concessions to alternate views. Willing to acknowledge, the the fact that what you're presenting is a theory, but not so much that it makes you sound less than, that makes you sound unconfident in your theory, right? I mean, that's the trick. If you overdo it, then it makes your theory less convincing, less persuasive. If you do it at strategic moments, then it makes the reader more inclined to trust you as as an objective, as an objective, person, and as an objective and fair person who's representing this case. And then pathos, and this is another one where being strategic is important. So you can use emotional appeals to demonstrate the importance, relevance of your claims or the text you are discussing. And this can be especially effective in an introduction and a conclusion. As you're trying to demonstrate that what you've just written is actually relevant to the reader. You might also use emotional appeals to capture the pathos of the text itself. How the text is trying to make the readers feel about something. But you want to avoid using pathos to communicate your personal feelings about the text, that should say, or topic. Okay, so you don't want it to turn into a rant against, Reading Girl was so frustrating for me because it's all one long sentence and I can't tell what's going on and who is speaking, and it made me a little angry because I don't think that this is an appropriate style of parenting, and that, so you're getting into sort of your personal your emotional reaction to the text. And you don't want to go there, other than to maybe try to make a claim for, if your emotional reaction is what you believe the author's intended effect is, that this is the author has used pathos to create this emotional reaction in you, then then that's something that you want to discuss, right? But you want to discuss it in terms of how the author uses pathos, not in terms of how you personally responded, how because your emotional impact is going to be influenced by a lot of things other than the text, right? Your personal experiences, your what you've done that day, how soon you've eaten, so it's there's so many things that influence your emotional reaction to something. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to focus only on the extent to which your emotional reaction is an intended impact by the author of the text. Okay, so that's it. So that covers the main concepts of chapter 3. I know it's a lot, so that's one reason why I wanted to get it into a video. But hopefully this will be helpful as a reference going forward. All right. Okay, so thank you, and have a great day.